Quick word of thanks to Professor Bob Kennedy and all of his students who have turned their classroom over to us for this extraordinary opportunity to learn from and exchange ideas from two of the most experienced diplomats in Washington who represent two countries that are among the closest allies and strongest economic partners of the United States. And of course, France and Germany were founding members of the European Union. It's my distinct honor and privilege to welcome Their Excellencies Ambassador Klaus Scharioth of Germany and Ambassador Pierre Vimont of France to our campus for this important and timely dialogue on the European-American agenda. It's the mission of the European Union Center of Excellence to promote knowledge and understanding of the European Union and the transatlantic relationship. And this is indeed an exceptional and rare opportunity to have such distinguished diplomats here to help us fulfill part of that mandate by sharing their wisdom and their views on the recently ratified Lisbon Treaty that ushers in a new era of institutional and political development in the European Union, and to discuss the significance of those changes of how Europe coordinates its policies and projects its power and values on the international stage. No one could be better suited to help us understand the complexities of European integration and governance and the EU-US relationship than these two ambassadors. I'd like to introduce them briefly. Dr. Klaus Scharioth, Ambassador of Germany, assumed the position of Ambassador to the Federal Republic of Germany to the United States in the spring of 2006. Immediately prior to his appointment, he served a 4-year term as State Secretary of the German Foreign Office. Other diplomatic appointments include serving as the Chief of Staff of NATO's Secretary General, representative to the permanent mission of the Federal Republic of Germany to the United Nations, and Vice Chairman of the UN's Legal and Charter Committees. The United States can claim at least partial credit for his impressive record of diplomatic service, as many of his educational credentials were obtained here in our country, studying at Harvard Law and the John F. Kennedy School of Government, and then earning his PhD from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. We also are fortunate to have Ambassador Pierre Vimont, who was appointed Ambassador of France to the United States in August of 2007. And prior to this appointment, he was Chief of Staff to the French Minister of Foreign Affairs since 2002. From 1999 to 2002, Mr. Vimont served as Ambassador and Permanent Representative of France to the European Union. He also served as Chief of Staff to the French Minister of European Affairs, and at the European Community level, he served as Director for Development of Scientific Technical Relations and Director of European Cooperation. Ambassador Vimont holds a law degree and is a graduate of the Institute of Political Studies, or as we say here, Sciences Po, which everyone knows. Many of France's leading prominent political leaders have been trained there, and we're very fortunate to say now we send at least 5 Georgia Tech students each year to study and obtain a certificate from Sciences Po. So it's again just a thrill for me and a deep honor and privilege to welcome Their Excellencies Ambassador Scharioth and Ambassador Vimont to our campus. And I'd like to ask them now to join me at the stage. Thank you. I'd like to make just a quick word to announce the format. We are going to begin by allowing each of our distinguished guests to make an opening statement of 5 to 10 minutes. And then I will have the privilege of moderating a discussion with the two ambassadors for about half an hour. And after that, we'll open up the conversation to you all, our audience. So without further ado, Ambassador Scharioth, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for the nice introduction, and thank you for having me here at Georgia Tech. Great pleasure to be here, to be back to Georgia, and for the first time to be here at Georgia Tech. Let me just say a few words about the Lisbon Treaty and then about the transatlantic agenda. We were very happy, not only in Germany, but I think all over Europe, that on December 1st of last year, finally the so-called Lisbon Treaty entered into force. Why was it so important? It was important because the European community, which France, the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg and Italy and Germany had founded in 1957, had not only become the European Union, but it had grown from 6 to 27 countries. And we found that the rules which we had established in 1957 did not apply any longer effectively to a union of 27. And that's why we had the idea to have a convention, not just a governmental conference, but a convention of people from all walks of life to come together from all countries in Europe, in the European Union, and to formulate what we thought at the time would be a European constitution. And we were lucky to have the former French president, Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, to share that convention. And it produced a constitution, which was later, because for some people it seemed to be a bit ambitious, it was later changed to the Lisbon Treaty. And now finally, after 8 years of work, it entered into force. What does it do? It makes it easier for Europe to act because we reduce the number of cases where we need consensus. With 6 countries, it's very easy to find consensus. With 27, you can imagine it's much more difficult. We also have now a European president. We have a foreign minister who is called High Representative, but she is a foreign minister. And we have a European Foreign Service. It's called External Action Service, but it's the beginning of a foreign service. I'm so pleased that I can share this forum today, this podium, with my friend Pierre Vimont, because for 2 reasons. First, he's a personal friend, and second, it's good to have my French colleague here, because I don't think I tell you a secret. Whenever France and Germany go together in Europe, I think the chances of success are quite big. And if you go back into the history of the European Union, you will find that practically all projects were German-French initiatives, projects which brought Europe forward. This Lisbon Treaty is also important because it is my deep conviction that practically all problems which we have on the agenda today are global problems. And because they are of a global nature, they are no longer of a regional nature, so Europe or America could not solve them alone. Therefore, we need very close cooperation between the United States of America and Europe. And my thesis is, to be very simple, whenever we achieve that close cooperation, we will succeed. If we don't, I think failure is not far away. So my key thesis is Europe and America have to work together. And that's why we need common brainstormings, we need common analysis of the problems which are around. We need also joint decisions and preferably also joint action. I think this is increasingly happening. I think on both sides of the Atlantic, the insight is growing that we can only succeed if Europe and America work together. Because practically in all instances, you will find that those solutions for global problems originate usually on one of the 2 sides of the Atlantic and then are taken over also, embraced also by other countries. Let me just, before I finish, just mention to you what I consider to be the most important subjects on the transatlantic agenda, on the global agenda, and then be very brief about saying something. I believe the most important problems are climate change and energy independence. That's number 1. I think nuclear non-proliferation and nuclear disarmament is number 2. Then I think the problem of our economic crisis and also of the financial crisis is a very urgent one. Failing states is number 4 on my list. Then you have the problem of terrorism. You have also particular problems like Afghanistan, Pakistan, Today we have the conference in London, and we will only succeed if we work together. We have the problem of Iran, where France, Germany, and Britain together began very important consultations and negotiations with the Iranians, and where we did succeed for 2 years, but now I'm very glad to say we also very closely cooperate with the United States and also with Russia and China. But then there are also other problems like Mideast and also a common stand towards Russia. Just before I close, a few words on some of those problems. Why is climate change and energy independence so important? It is important because we always are not very good in acting on problems which we don't see, which we don't feel immediately. And the problem with climate change is that there is a time lag, that the results and the effects of our non-action will only be felt 10, 15 years later after they have been done. That's the problem. Still, we need to act immediately because now science is unanimous that there is not only the fact that climate change is man-made, it is also something which is obvious, which does exist, and it is the window to address it is closing rapidly. So we were a bit disappointed about the Copenhagen conference. The European Union has said that we will reduce our CO2 emissions in comparison to 1990 by 20%. We will, and if others do something similar, even by 30%. We will also increase our energy efficiency by 20% by 2020. And we will also increase the share of renewable energy, which currently is at about 7% in Europe, to 20% by 2020. But we need to do all of that together. It cannot just be Europe or not just be America which need to act. We all need to act together, but only if Europe and America do something very similar do we have a chance to convince the Chinese and the Indians and the Brazilians and many others. So it is an absolute necessity. I think it is doable. We, for instance, in Germany have reduced already our CO2 emissions in comparison to 1919 by 24%. And we have increased the share of renewable energy in the last 8 years from 6.7% to more than 16%, so a 10% increase in 8 years. It is doable. And I think a last consideration, even if you believe it's not just, even if you are skeptical about climate change, there are two other reasons to do it, to act. First, you can create jobs. It's good for the economy. We, for instance, in Germany have created in the last 8-9 years 280,000 jobs in this field. That means about 30,000 per year. So it's a job engine. It's the fastest growing sector in Germany. And you also can increase energy independence from other countries. We import gas and most of our oil. Now, I don't want to speak longer. I think the other subjects I would leave to discussion. But just let me say, for instance, as the example Iran shows, that we can only succeed if we work together. When the three of us, Germany, France, and Britain, began talks with the Iranians in 2003 to ask them to stop enrichment and reprocessing, because this is not really necessary if you go for civil nuclear energy. You only need those two things when you go for a nuclear weapon. We did succeed for 2 years. For 2 years, the Iranians suspended those two practices. They allowed, as we had demanded, they allowed monitors from the International Atomic Energy Agency into their country. And for 2 years, we had succeeded. Problem is, the government changed. Maybe also our package at the time was not ambitious enough. Anyhow, we have the problem that the Iranians suspended their suspension in the summer of 2005. And therefore, I'm very, very happy that now the United States has joined us, because we believe that if we really want to have a chance to convince the Iranians, we need also the United States on board. Without the United States, I don't think we have the chance in the long run, as important our initiative was of the three of us. In the long run, we need the big gorilla in the room, and that's the United States. And that's, on this happy note, I finish here.
Impressive.
Thank you. Ambassador Vimont.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me and inviting Klaus to Georgia Tech. I've been here already once, and I must say it's always very impressive to be back again here in this great university. It's also a great pleasure to be here with Klaus. The truth is that we have been more or less living together for the last 24 hours, except that we didn't take the same flight to come here, but many events took place yesterday in Washington, State of the Union address among them, and we have, it is true, this very close relation, and I think it's a testimony to the partnership between Germany and France that we are both here together. What could I add to what Klaus has said, and that was already very complete and very full? Maybe give you two ideas that could help us to go through the conversation that we will have afterwards. I think that to a large extent, our two unions, the United States of America on one side, the European Union on the other side, we are experiencing the same kind of adaptation and evolution inside our borders to adapt ourselves and to be ready to play a role and a part in the global world we're facing today. Your president has stated once again yesterday in the State of the Union address that he wanted to bring new foundation for your country. What in fact we have been doing with the Lisbon Treaty is more or less the same. And the truth is, if you look at it from a historical perspective, is that for this result to be reached, it was not only, as Klaus said, that we had to go through this whole convention since 2000, but in fact we have tried even before. If you look at the European history, it started more or less around 1992, at the time when we reached an agreement on the Maastricht Treaty, and we set up the European Monetary Union and the European single currency. Since then, and because we knew that we were going to enlarge Europe as we were going ahead, never forget that in 1992 we were 12, and 12 years later we were 27. So we doubled our membership in a very short time. And as we knew that we were going to have to deal with that, as Klaus was saying, the need to be more efficient, to have new institutions, we started to discuss, and it was through the Treaty of Amsterdam, the Amsterdam Treaty, then the Nice Treaty, and then at last the Lisbon Treaty, that time and again we have tried to get a good balance, institutional balance on one side, the whole question of the qualified majority on the other side, the need to get a better legal framework, and many other issues. I won't go into that. We may come back to it through our question and answers as we go along. But I think what is important to understand is that as this process has been rather difficult, and in fact we have seen that in many of our countries, certainly in France, but I think in other countries also, public opinion was becoming more and more easy with what we were trying to do. If you look at this 17 or 18 years since the Maastricht Treaty, in fact, the whole framework of the European Union has evolved in a very interesting way, with new practices coming in, going from a system where the European Commission was really at the center of the whole institutional framework. Haha, we're in the dark now. Back to the light. To a system much more complicated, with a very delicate balance between the role played by the member states and the role played by the more integrated institution like the European Commission and the European Parliament. And this has been a difficult battle, in fact. This has been a very strong infighting between member states and the ones who were supporting a more integrated approach and those who were more in favor of more power to the member states. We have reached a balance at the moment. You can be assured that it's not finished, and this is part of European story, that time and again we go back discussing about what we should do. That does not mean that we will have a new treaty. I don't think so. It has been so difficult to get an agreement on the Lisbon Treaty. I am sure that Klaus would agree with me on that, is that I don't think you will see in the near future a new treaty, but you will see in the practice, in the everyday practice of our institutions, new difficulties may be appearing here and there, new evolutions, new developments, if only because we have those new figures that have appeared now. President of the European Council on one side, foreign minister or high representative who is having much more powers than Javier Solana, the predecessor. This is in fact a very interesting figure, institutional figure, half council on one side, half commission on the other side. And to find the proper way for those two new personalities to get their act together and to become part of the whole institutional scenery, you're going to see a very interesting practice developing as we go on. So I think, first point, you're going to see more and more of this European Union evolving and adapting itself inside its institutional framework. My second point, and this is where I come back to what Klaus was saying also about this transatlantic partnership and the very strong relationship between the United States on one side and the European Union on the other side. I think what we're facing today altogether is also there, just like in the case I was stating before, that together we have to find our part and the role we want to play together in this global world that is slowly moving in. After 1945, when the transatlantic partnership set up its institution, NATO, OECD, the European Union, and the kind of institution we set up between our two unions, regular meetings, annual meetings, recently under the German presidency, this Transatlantic Economic Council, and you have now a council, Transatlantic Energy Council also that has been set up. Those institutions were developing in a rather smooth way. We had a field day, I would say, between 1945 and today. We seem to be very much in control of the situation. We had one main problem, which was the confrontation with the Soviet Union. The values that we were supporting about democracy, human rights, were accepted by many around the world, except for the eastern part, of course. And it seemed to us that as we went along, we had a clear idea about what we should do. In 1989, with the fall of the Berlin Wall, things changed, and the Western countries, and certainly the transatlantic partnership, could have the impression that we were now on top of in the international community at a time where a new stability was going to get in, and our Western values and our Western point of view with regard to all the international affair was about to triumph. And in fact, what we have seen since then is that the world has evolved in a totally different way. And there are some lessons to be learned from there on. We have found out with this new global world coming in that, first of all, it wasn't stability that was there, but it was more, on the contrary, more instability that was gaining in. Because there were new actors coming in, there were new issues coming out, like climate change that Klaus was mentioning a few minutes ago. And there were the need for new international institutions. As we have seen, it was difficult to go on ruling the international community with groups like the G8 or even maybe the UN in its previous form. as we're going on, we see very obviously that we have to find new ways of doing that. The G20 has emerged mainly because of the financial crisis we have been going through since a little bit more than 1 year. But you have certainly heard also about the need and the urgency to change the Security Council and its present membership in order to have countries precisely like Germany or a few others to be allowed as permanent members on the side, and France is very much supporting that. And all this has given a clear impression that our world needs new ways of going through. And I think what is very important at the time when this global world is slowly emerging is that if you look at what the transatlantic partnership represents, you could see that there is a real risk of our influence slowly being reduced and dropping. In today's world, we represent altogether, United States and the European Union, something like half, 50% of the world wealth. We represent more or less 1/6 of the total population. But if you look at the trends in the years ahead, and because of the increasing importance of the Chinese economy, of India, of Brazil, who are coming in, we will only represent 1/3 of the world wealth in 20 or 30 years from now on. And maybe as we look at the acceleration of the Chinese growth, it could even come earlier than we expect. And the same thing for our population. We will only represent 1/9 of the total world population in about 20 or 30 years from now on. So in other words, what I want to stress is that if we still want to have this major influence that we have managed to have in the past, we better get our act together and we better work together in order to be able to play a major part in the world of tomorrow. And that means, as Klaus was saying, that on the main issues, whether it be climate change, whether it be how do we get out of the present economic and financial crisis, it means Afghanistan, it means Iran, it means the peace process in the Middle East also, our two entities, our two unions, have more than ever to work closely together and to defend and promote the ideas that we share. It's not only about the values that we share and the principles that we share, the fact that we have always been countries that are supporting the need for dialogue, for justice, for tolerance, the promotion of human rights, but it's also, as I was stressing a few minutes ago, the need to support the reform of our international institution in order to bring new institutions, or at least reform of the present institution, and maybe also new working methods as we go ahead. Just to give you one obvious example, and I will end there to allow room for the discussion. It's the Copenhagen summit. More than 192 countries gathered together for a few days, and we have seen how chaotic, how difficult all this was being managed. And I think the clear assessment that many of us had at the end of this meeting was that if we want by any chance to be able to push forward the whole issue of climate change, we will have to look back again at the way we have been working. And to some extent, maybe the need will appear more and more for a group of countries, not all the 192, but a group of countries, maybe in an informal way, with a clear mandate from the other ones, to try to work together in order to draft the kind of solutions that we need to have, and to be able afterwards to present them to the whole group. This need for a group of countries being able to work together and to negotiate in an efficient way is becoming more and more obvious, and we have more than ever to try to look at the way we can push those ideas forward and get some results there. And let's be honest, as we increase the membership of the European Union from 27 to certainly more than 30 members as we go ahead, by a way or another, we will have to bring inside our institutional system more flexibility and more possibilities for a smaller number of member states to work together when necessary. After all, that's what we're already doing with regard to the Iranian issue. It's the three countries Klaus was mentioning, Germany, the United Kingdom and France, that are working inside a group with the United States, Russia and China, and who are to some extent being delegated by the other members of the European Union to push forward this negotiation and to be able to come back afterwards to the whole group of the member states to explain to them what we're trying to do. And much of that kind of method, I think we will see more and more as we go ahead with our European construction and our European initiatives. I'll stop there. These were thoughts, food for thoughts, I would say. And now I'm quite ready to go on with this discussion.
Thank you so much. And indeed, these were very comprehensive and insightful comments, and it renders my task of looking through my prepared questions quite difficult now and redundant. But since you both mentioned the recent Copenhagen summit and noted also the effect that the Lisbon Treaty will have on the European Union's ability to act in a more unified and effective way on the international stage, let's consider this opportunity, the first opportunity that the European Union had to exercise such global leadership at the UN Conference on Climate Change. The EU was very well positioned, as you know, to demonstrate this newfound leadership, as Europe has been at the forefront of green technologies, renewable energies, ambitious commitments to binding reductions on greenhouse gas emissions, and very generous pledges also to assist developing countries as they transition to a lower carbon economy. Yet Europe found itself essentially ignored or sidelined by China and the United States. And indeed, the recent confirmation hearings of the German appointee to the European Commission confessed and admitted quite frankly that before the European Parliament that the Climate Change Summit had exposed the bloc's limited influence on the international stage. I hope you can correct this pessimistic assessment for us and explain why and how this transpired, particularly in an area where Europe was already a global leader in this issue of tackling climate change and has made important steps to move towards a common energy policy. Could you comment on this and I hope assure us that it doesn't bode something altogether pessimistic about Europe's aspirations and its new institutional mechanisms to project a more coherent and unified voice on important global challenges like climate change?
Vicki, I would agree with you that on substance, the European position was a very good one, with 20% CO2 reductions in comparison to 1990, 30% if others do the same thing, 20% renewables, 20% increase in energy efficiency. All this was very good. I believe that for many reasons, because in some countries public opinion was lagging behind, I'm speaking all over the world, I think we were not as good as we could have been in preparing Copenhagen. I think there was a defect, and I think rather than now thinking what we could have done better in Copenhagen, I think we should concentrate what and how we can do that in 2010. And that's why the Chancellor Angela Merkel has invited everybody to Bonn for a conference in the late spring to prepare, because we didn't have this preparatory conference before Copenhagen, and I think it was a mistake, and I think it relates to what Pierre said. I think Copenhagen showed that it's very difficult to reach any result at 192. Very difficult. I served at the United Nations. I speak a bit out of experience, and I think we will have to find informal formats preparing possible solutions, of course, with everybody else in mind. You know, they also have to have in mind that everybody at the end will have to sign up. But I think that's what this Bonn conference is hoping to do. And I very much hope that we all learn the lesson from Copenhagen, that we have to be better in preparing Mexico at the end of the year. I still believe the case for acting has become even stronger. And I very much hope that each of us is doing with his own public what needs to be done to convince everybody that the window will close if we don't act decisively and rapidly.
Thank you.
Could I add just one or two additional observations, and going straight to your question, Vicki? Europeans at Copenhagen, the 27 of them, may not have been as efficient as they would have loved to be, and maybe have not appeared as a single entity as much as it would have been necessary. But certainly, and that brings me back to what I was saying earlier on about flexibility, some of the European leaders, and namely Angela Merkel, Gordon Brown, and President Sarkozy, were very active in the margins, worked very hard with President Obama when he arrived, and were part of the meeting, the last meeting that reached an agreement. So they were there, and they were representing, of course, Europe as such, and they, of course, were supporting and defending and promoting precisely the different commitments that were being made at the European level. So this is, once again, another example of the fact that one has to adapt its institutions to this reality. Second observation, and I will stop there. What is maybe as important as Copenhagen is the post-Copenhagen we're entering now. In other words, whatever we may think about the results of Copenhagen, there has been some result. There has been one or two, even maybe a little bit more commitments. And now what is important is to get those commitments being implemented. And there you're going to see again very much the European Union in the forefront to be sure that what has been decided and agreed in Copenhagen is really going to be put into action. So watch carefully.
If I could just follow up, I'd like to ask a question about the importance of French-German leadership within the European Union. And this year is a particularly important moment as we celebrate the 60th anniversary of the declaration of the Schuman Declaration and the beginning, the birth of the European project, and one that I like to remind my students. It has produced the world's greatest success story of turning bitter enemies, your two countries, and arch rivals into friends, and building a common future of peace, stability, and prosperity. And as the European project has developed from a very small area of cooperation in coal and steel in the 1950s and 6 member states to today's 27 member states, including 8 former communist regime countries, along that 6-decade trajectory, it's often been asserted that progress was made in large part because of the French-German cooperation and leadership at the heart of the integration project. And in fact, it's often referred to, France and Germany are often referred to as the twin engines propelling European integration forward. Though some speculate with the enormity of the 2004 enlargement, bringing in 10 new countries, that this French-German leadership role has been somewhat dislodged. And I would like to ask you to reflect on how important, how vital is your cooperation and leadership to the continued success of the European project, and what are the prospects and areas in which French-German leadership will be absolutely essential and imperative as a new cornerstone for this new phase of European Union history. And if I could just tack on some areas of possible tension, since we've been talking about climate change, your countries have very different approaches to energy policy. Even though there is an attempt to forge a common energy policy at the EU level, you have very different energy matrices. France, almost 80% of its energy is supplied through nuclear capabilities, and German society has, at least until very recently, been completely hostile to the use of nuclear energy for electricity and so forth. That's one area. There also, again, the impact of 10 new countries coming in and changing the dynamic of both Germany's relationship with countries such as Poland? How does it change the balance of the relationship between France and Germany, France, Germany, the EU, and the Russian relationship? So if I could just ask you to reflect on all of those issues and tell us what you think the prospects are for continued strength of this motor of European integration that is France and Germany.
I think it's essential. I think without French-German cooperation, it will be very difficult to achieve progress. It has changed, there's no doubt. We are extremely grateful to Robert Schuman, to Jean Monnet, and others like Konrad Adenauer, who overcame in 1950 the idea that international politics is a zero-sum game, and they invented the win-win situation, and I think it has proven correct. As you said, the coal and steel community in 52, the community, the EU later on, I think a big success. You're also right that in 2004 we have now, since 2004, we have a different picture. We have more countries in there, and therefore you have to do what we just mentioned in the Copenhagen conference, also on a smaller scale in the EU. You always have to think that any solution which we might pursue must, of course, be acceptable to all 27. But for reasons which we could explain in detail, I personally believe there is no substitute for German-French leadership, for various reasons. There are no other countries in a similar position to have the possibility to lead. And you rightly point out that on some areas we have very different structures in our societies. But that's the reason why the two of us can lead. Because if France and Germany do agree on something with very different, in some areas, with very different interests, that can be the beginning of a solution which could be acceptable by all. And to just give you the example of nuclear energy, which you mentioned, of course we have a different situation. As you said, France, I think is more than 80% from its electricity production is nuclear. We have just 23%, and we have a very different public perception, there's no doubt. I think it has to do with Chernobyl, because in Chernobyl the nuclear clouds, they got into Germany, they did not get into France, and therefore, yeah, you see,
jumped over.
You see, it was really interesting. The wind switched, you know, when pretty close when it was over the western part of Germany, and then it blew the other way. And you see, because in my youth in Germany, nuclear energy was extremely popular, and Germany was, together with other countries like France, at the forefront of development of civilian nuclear energy. 4 things happened. Chernobyl, and that did not affect France as much. Then there is a perception in Germany that if we do not solve the waste problem, people hesitate to spend all the money on that. Then there is the question how to safeguard, how to make nuclear power plants safe against terrorists. So there is concerns, but I think this is not insurmountable. And again, it's one of the examples where you have different public perceptions, and still we do get common solutions. And that, I think, is the beauty of the relationship.
To some extent, I totally agree with what Klaus said, but I would even go further. I think at the heart of the relationship between Germany and France is precisely the fact that on many issues we were in totally contradictory interest. Never forget that at the beginning of the European Union, what was called then the European Community, it was a trade-off between German industry and France agriculture. And that's how we started the whole process in 1957 and the first negotiations that took place around 1960, 1962. You could say the same thing about monetary union. It was a single currency on one side against the request, and rightly so, by the German authorities for more discipline in our public expenditure, in our budgets. You could say the same thing about the institution. Germany, during many years, was much more supportive of the European Commission and the European Parliament than France, who was, on the contrary, supporting the Council of Ministers. And this is precisely, as Klaus was saying, that the fact that Germany and France were able to find a compromise on all those issues, and that in fact the other partners were able to follow us, that we managed to go along. For anybody who has been working as I did and practicing the work in Brussels, this is very obvious. And I could go further than that. Both our countries, quite often during many years, were in fact the leaders of a group that defending special interest. And the fact that our two countries were able to find an agreement working together brought immediately the other countries inside. And I think, to be honest, that's one of the reasons why for many years for our British partner, it was very difficult to get into that, because Britain has always had its own interest on its own. It was, in other words, a member state of its own who didn't have many countries with him at that time. And therefore, to see this German-French partnership that was able to strike deals here and there, and they felt like being left on their own side, wasn't a very pleasant situation for them. What I think, and it's true, is that now that we're 27, it has become more complicated, and the fact that German and French can agree on something and find a compromise doesn't mean automatically that all the others can gather around that compromise, because we have new set of interests. The new members have their own concern, their own interests that they want to promote that are not exactly the same. In other words, the situation is more complicated. But that doesn't mean that the French-German partnership can't play a big part still, and we have seen it very recently. For all those who have been saying that this German-French relationship couldn't play any more an important and significant part in the way we go ahead inside the European Union, those who have said that had to admit since then that on many issues, climate change for instance, or the way we have found our way through the financial crisis in the past year, all this have shown once again that this partnership was absolutely essential, as Klaus has been saying, to go ahead. And once again, I think it is really, in fact, the sheer and the mere foundation of everything that we have been building up since 1957.
Thank you so much for those excellent responses. I will pose one more question before we open it up to the audience, and it's tough for me to decide which of the questions I want to ask, but I'm going to take the risk because I think this is important for the public to think about, and that is all of the criticism that emerged once the nominations were made for these two new important leadership posts. Herman Van Rompuy, the former Belgian Prime Minister who became the first full-time president, and Baroness Catherine Ashton, who assumed the role of High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy. The reactions and widespread reactions in the press and the public were uncharitable, to say the least. And I think more troubling than that was the charge that these two more troubling than the charge that these two individuals were relative unknowns was the assertion that this appointment or these appointments were somewhat of a sign of a triumph of national interest. over the Union's ambitions and goals, and more pointedly reflected this unwillingness of national leaders to be somewhat overshadowed by big personalities, names that had been circulating to fill the post. Can you comment on that? Do you share that assessment? Was the criticism overblown? And can you perhaps give us a more optimistic view of Europe's new leaders?
I think the criticism is a bit unfair. You see, we in Europe, we didn't really need someone who was giving press conferences and who would be the best speaker under the sun. That was not what we were looking for. As Pierre explained, we are 27 countries with sometimes very different interests. But what we have understood is that if we want to influence anything in the world, we have no alternative than to speak with one voice. That's the only chance Europe has. I mean, otherwise, we are still 8% of the world population, but otherwise, if we don't speak with one voice, we have no chance. Example, I think Iran, Germany, France, Britain, and I think we were heard. One voice. Now, to do that, you need a person who can reconcile those interests and who is used at working behind the scenes without looking necessarily for the limelight. And now, I don't want to say anything about Belgium, but just like Pierre, I've lived for 4 years there in Belgium, and I know a little bit about it. And now, how do I phrase that diplomatically? It's not an easy country. You have many conflicts. How do I phrase that? You have different groups who have very different interests, and I must say I have the deepest respect for former Prime Minister Van Rompuy, who not only managed to keep the country together, which does not go without saying, but he also found solutions to almost insolvable problems. Of course, that he did not celebrate that in big press conferences is true, but I think it speaks for him. I don't think it's an argument against him, I think it's an argument for him. And so I'm impressed with that selection. I think he will do an extraordinarily good job, and I think the same will be true for Catherine Ashton.
What can I add to what Klaus has said? And I agree totally with that, if only because we're both diplomats and we have to be careful. But really, to be honest, I resented what was said by the press when those two personalities were selected, because I think, first of all, nobody has seen what they have done. Of course, they have just started, and so let's wait a little bit and let's give them a chance. That's the first point. The second point, and I think if I can only lead you, all of you, to study closely what has become really maybe the most important institution in the European Union, which is the European Council. This is a meeting today of 27 heads of state or government that are very shrewd politicians that look at each other, that like to see who are the strong ones, who are the weak ones, etc. And the fact that they picked up Van Rompuy, the former Prime Minister from Belgium, tells a lot about what they thought would be the best personality to take that job, which is a very complicated one, let's be honest, precisely for the reasons that you said a few moments ago. Because those leaders, each one of them is the main personality in their own country, certainly do intend to keep on playing a role in international affairs. And therefore, if they have agreed to select among themselves one person to be the chairman, in other words, They want to be sure that, of course, they will retain some responsibility and some role to play. And for the one that has been selected, it's becoming very tricky to find his place. And look at what he has done since he has been designated. In less than 2 months, he has gone to see all the leaders in the different capitals, come up with an idea that for the first European Council that he's going to share, they should pick up the whole issue about the future of our economies. And everybody has said, what a brilliant idea. We hadn't thought about it, and it's perfect. So I think he has shown already that he is a man that one should not disregard and dismiss too lightly. As for Lady Ashton, I think the same thing will happen also. Just give her some time. She has a very difficult task, I think even maybe more complicated than the task that has been thrown upon Mr. Van Rompuy, because, as I was saying previously, she's a member of the Commission and she's also a member of the Council. She has to set up a whole new administration that will be called the European Service for External Relations, and that will encompass members from the European administration, members from officials from the member state, members from the council, officials from the council. Those people have totally different administrative culture. To bring them all together and then make them work together, it's going to take some time also. So let's give them a chance once again. And I think that it is a bit ludicrous, to be to say the least, that one could already right from the beginning decide that those people were not fit for the job.
I agree, and this is why I wanted to pose the question, even though I hesitated somewhat, but I felt very frustrated as I read all of the negative reports in the news, and I was just waiting for that wonderful op-ed that would say something that highlighted what an interesting process this is, and how it does reflect, I think, the complexities and the art of compromise and the creative solutions that the European Union has put forward, and I'm hopeful too that they will be strong leaders. It's now time to open up to the audience, and I see an eager person, but I first have to fulfill my promise that the first few minutes will be given over to 3 special classes, and you will be the next in line, I promise.
Sorry.
So first, Professor Bob Kennedy and the students from the International Affairs course, I'd like to give you an opportunity, and let me just ask all of you to please pose as concise a question as possible, and try to stay away from monologues, because you can tell you will have very rich responses from our 2 ambassadors. So please try to keep your questions brief. And Professor Kennedy, I'll let you look around and see if your students have questions, or if you yourself would like to pose the first question.
Let's see if my students, and students in class like to raise a question. Don't be bashful, I know it's interesting. Yeah, I think we can go with that. Let me just ask a very brief question that will require a long answer. Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia. How does the European Union, in your view, see their role in moderating the authoritarian regime in Belarus under Lukashenko, bringing Russia more closely into cooperation with the West, and getting recent changes in Ukraine?
Yeah, easy question. Easy question. On Belarus, I think we are beginning to see some, I can see it slow, but some progress. I have the feeling that more and more people in Belarus are getting annoyed about being told from abroad what to do. And therefore, I believe there is a better chance to get closer to Belarus than we have had in previous years. And also, what we in the EU call the Eastern Partnership, I think is beginning to work. I think people in Belarus see that this European Union is quite an attractive partner. And so I would say that here I at least detect the first elements of a positive movement. And I think that also the kind of sanctions which we imposed on visa for certain people, I think they begin also to play a role. But I think, of course, always this has to be a dual-track thing. You never achieve anything in international affairs just by sticks. The carrots have always to play an important role. Ukraine, of course, is very, very important for the map of Europe. We have a strong interest in an independent, a sovereign, a democratic Ukraine in which there is the rule of law. We therefore do whatever we can to help Ukraine. The EU has offered substantial help. We were very pleased with the Orange Revolution. Now, of course, the Ukrainians have to solve their internal problems themselves. That's nothing for intervention from the outside. But I can assure you that the European Union has this interest, this very strong interest in an independent Ukraine. Just by the way, as NATO does, and it will be no secret to anyone here that this was the idea when we created in 1997 the NATO-Ukraine Commission to strengthen the Ukrainian hand to keep their independence.
Just to add to what Klaus was saying, and maybe to enlarge a little bit the answer to your question, I think you have put the finger on what, in my opinion, is really the major success story of the European Union. It's this exceptional ability, if you go through all the years since 1957, this incredible ability to bring stability, which means peace and prosperity, to bring stability to the European continent. Because what's happening with Belarus and also with Ukraine is exactly what Klaus is saying, the attraction of the European Union to those countries, and the fact that we are able to exert some friendly pressure on those countries, and to tell them, if you want to have stronger relations with the Union, maybe even one day for some of those countries become a member, you have to adapt yourself to what are the values, the principles, and the rules of the European Union. What you are seeing with Belarus moving slowly in the right direction, with Ukraine, this is exactly what you have seen with the Balkans. We had this terrible war in the 1990s. We went out of it with great difficulty, and thanks also to the assistance of the United States. But since then, and since we have taken one by one all these countries, from Croatia to Macedonia up to Albania to Serbia in the near future, we have been able to take each one of these countries and told them, if you want to set up special relationship, partnership, and then maybe afterwards membership, full-fledged membership of the European Union, you have to change your behavior. You have to be a good neighbor with the countries surrounding you. You have to adapt your economy to the rules that we apply in the European Union. And once again, we bring slowly those countries in the same path as the one we have been going through. The success of the enlargement with countries like Hungary and Romania, with Slovakia and others, many of those countries had great difficulties and even major problems between themselves. Just think for the last year or so, it hasn't been too much publicized, but there was a real problem between Croatia and Slovenia on the question of their border, as you know. And we said to these two countries, one being a full-fledged member of the European Union, the other one being a candidate who's going through an accession negotiation, the fact that the European Union has been able to say to these two countries, we have to find a solution, otherwise we won't go along with the whole negotiation with Croatia, etc. We have managed to find a solution. And this is a very tricky, sensitive issue between these two countries. Europe, time and again, has been able to go ahead to find solution and to bring all those countries together. And this is the major success story, and I think this is also the contradiction we're facing. Because this is a success story, we have to go on enlarging, because I think this is the proper way to go ahead. But as we enlarge and we're becoming, we've got an increased membership, then we're facing a problem of efficiency and working rules and working method. So we have this other side of the coin that we have to look at.
Thank you. Next, we have two special classes that are here and part of our innovative curriculum called Languages Across the Curriculum. We're offering two courses this semester. One, they're both team taught by international affairs professors and modern language professors on the subject of the role of Germany in the European Union, instructed entirely in German. You'll be happy to know.
Very good.
And a course that...
Ich rede jetzt nur noch Deutsch.
And the other one is on the role of France in European and global affairs, taught entirely...
Also in German, I guess.
No, taught entirely in French. So both of those...
I prefer that.
And I have the opportunity of team teaching the course in French with my colleague, Professor Cotifoli. So now I'd like to ask Professor Weber or Professor Cawthron for the German class if you have questions to pose, and then we'll turn to the French class before opening to the audience. So, Professor Weber? Colby, I see your hand up.
Thank you. My question was really concerning common European security and defense policy and the NATO. And I was wondering if either of you could foresee in the future sometime if there could be a conflict that arises between NATO and the common European security and defense policy. Whether the membership of a country in NATO will end up trumping the membership in the European security and defense policy, or if members will continue to be more allegiant to NATO.
I don't buy the thesis that there is a conflict between what we call ESDP, or now it's called Common Security Defense Policy, and NATO. I think they are two policies which complement each other. And I can say that here there is a German-French joint paper which originated the whole thing. So this is another example where it was the German-French engine which pushed ESDP forward. Why does it complement each other? Just take an example like, for instance, in the Balkans. In the Balkans, we had the feeling that we needed the United States. We needed United States of America, and therefore it was natural that this was, in the beginning, something for NATO. But, for instance, take the example like supervising and safeguarding the elections in the Congo. The United States early on indicated that they would not be ready to go in there. We felt this was absolutely essential, because if this process, this election would not have been safeguarded, we could have seen a fallback into a more authoritarian time in the Congo as at that period. So we thought it was essential. And I think the European Union did a great service to everyone, that they said from very early on, this is something we do. We do it at ESDP. NATO does not really have to bother about it. And I think, in my view, it was a full success. So you see there are basically three possibilities. You have either just a pure NATO mission, you have a pure ESDP mission, Those are the two outside possibilities, but there's also another possibility that you have the EU, ESDP, acting using the assets of NATO. And that, of course, there are many very good examples for that too, because, of course, it does make sense to make optimal use of these assets. You don't want to create everything at all time anew. We have, for instance, we have a center which is running an operation like in the Congo. We do have that in Brussels. But for very large missions, it doesn't really make sense to recreate a second Mons where you have about 1,500 high-ranking military guys. And so we then use their planning capabilities, their logistical assets, whatever. And so this third possibility that the EU acts together with NATO, I think has also a big future. But in my view, they complement each other.
I certainly agree with that, and I think one has to look at the at how the minds have changed recently. Your question being asked 10 years ago, one could have accepted there was still maybe some controversy around the fact that you could have NATO on one side and the European policy for common security and defense. Things have changed. First of all, in this country, with the previous administration and now with this administration, there is a much more openness towards the idea of a European defense. In fact, there is now a real, genuine support towards that, and this has totally changed the perspective, of course, of the way the Europeans now can work on this one. And of course, I think the second thing that has been a major turning point also, and I apologize for talking about France, but it's the fact that my country has gone back into the military organization, integrated organization of NATO. This has totally changed the mind of many of the European member states, because for a long time they have always looked at France's insistence of pushing forward the idea of a European defense as a sort of battle and a fight from France against NATO. You can't say that anymore now that we're back into NATO. So the whole perspective has totally changed. And furthermore, I think, as Klaus was rightly saying, the fact that the Europeans have shown that in the Democratic Republic of Congo, or for instance at the border between Chad and Sudan, where we also had a military operation, the fact that a few years ago we were able also in the northern part of Congo, Democratic Republic of Congo, to have also an operation there to support and protect the airport there, Bunia. All this has shown that now we have some operational capacities, even today, around Somalia and the whole question of the pirates there. This has shown that the Europeans really could play a major part and were able and had the capacity to do that. Now, I think the main problem we're facing today is a different problem. It's not as much as a sort of competition between NATO and the European defense. It's more the willingness on behalf of the European member states to really be ready to build an enhanced and efficient European defense. Because let's be honest here again, the efforts so far have been mostly being made by Germany, Britain and France, who the three together represent something like 80 or 85% of the total military expenditures inside Europe. So that means that the 24 other members are looking at this with, I wouldn't say with reservation, but not putting maybe as much effort as would be necessary. So this is really where we have to work in the future, I think.
Thank you. Professor Weber, did you have a question?
Yes, you touched on my question, but I'd like to press you a little bit more. In 2004, T.R. Reid, a regular contributor to the Washington Post and NPR, wrote this book, The U.S. the United States of Europe, the new superpower, and the end of American supremacy. And in this book, he portrayed the EU as a rising global power. Just yesterday, Tony Barber in the Financial Times said, and I quote, "The destiny of the European Union appears to be that of a strictly regional rather than global giant, regional power rather than global giant." So it seems that the image has changed, and my question to you, should the EU worry about this, or might it be in its interest to be a regional power as long as it's willing to cooperate with important players like the US? So is there something to be gained by being a global power versus a regional power?
I would say that's a very difficult, but I think very good question. I would rather not look and discuss that in that terms, because I believe the days of the superpowers and the world powers, all these concepts, I think are, in my view, something of the past. I believe that we have to recognize that we have interests all over the world, but that doesn't make us necessarily a world power. I think we have interests. We have interests to defend, for instance, against terrorists. We have interests to defend against fundamentalist extremism, against the enemies of the open society. And sometimes we have to do that far beyond the limits of Europe. So Europe has interests, also of trade, also other interests, energy, which go beyond Europe. But I think this old concept of a world power is really dated. I would not say now that the EU is a world power, because that reminds me a little bit of a period which we have left behind, and that is the 19th century, where you had various powers vying for supremacy or trying to get the better of somebody else. I think all this is past. What we need to do is A, protect our own interests, and B, find solutions, common solutions to global problems. Because they will affect us if we don't find solutions, like climate, like energy, like nuclear non-proliferation, like states failing all over the world, like terrorism, like, for instance, global trade. If there would be protectionism, that would be very bad for all of us, not only for Europe. It would be very bad for the United States. So there are some things which need to be solved globally, but I refuse to think in these old concepts of world power or not world power. I don't want the EU to be a world power. I want the EU to see that she has also interests which go far beyond the European continent.
I think it's a question of definition. What would you think is a regional power? I would think it would mean a power that has ambitions limited to its region and whose influence is limited to its own region. And then if you look at European Union today and you really try to get the right picture about what it is, you shouldn't underestimate its power at the present moment, its influence. I'm saying so because, to my surprise, traveling around this country and talking with people from the business industries, think about Microsoft, for instance. The people from Microsoft never think that the European Union is a small power, because they have suffered from our competition regulations, and they never forget it, and they're very much aware of that. If you look at, for instance, the European standards in the field of telecommunication, the new technology of information, etc., they are the standards that are ruling at the moment, more or less, the whole industry on that field. And to some extent, even what's going on at the moment with clean technology is going to be very important. The fact that the Europeans together will be able to set up and to define the new standards for clean technology could have major importance. Why? Because we are, at the moment, altogether one of the most important economic power in the world and the first trade competitor around the world. And therefore what the Europeans are able to decide because of their single market and because they're forced to do that has a lot of implication for the rest of the world economy. That's the first point. The second point, of course, and there it's only a question of willingness among the Europeans to be ambitious and to want to play a part in what Klaus was stating on foreign policy, on security policy, etc. If we really are ambitious and ready to play a part, we can play a major role in many countries, in many parts, on many issues. Just think, for example, what is happening at the moment in the Middle East. The major contributor in terms of assistance to the Palestinian, to the different other countries in this area, is mostly a European contribution. And therefore, if the Europeans really want to play their part in this Middle East peace process, they have the tools to do it. It's only a question of political will and to try to help as much as they can, which is what they're trying to do at the moment. Europe is part of the quartet with the United States, Russians and the UN. We're part of many of the institutions or entities in the international community where we can have our voice heard and play a major part. The only question there is whether the member states are ready to make their voice heard and to put up their position and to speak loudly about it. But I think this is really the problem. It's a problem of first, have we the influence to play that part? And we have, in fact. We have the economic power to do that if we wish so. And do we have the real political ambition to do so? I think this is really what it's all about at the moment.
Thank you. If no other students, then Professor Cochran.
If global problems require global solutions, what can we call a legitimate global solution? I ask with reference to the comment of Mr. Vimont about new working methods and the lesson of Copenhagen. That is the need for a smaller working group with a mandate. For any global issue needing a global solution, how is that smaller group to be determined? How is their mandate to be established and on what principle? And is the principle of democratic global governance really at the base of the idea global problems need global solutions? Is that potentially compromised with these new working methods that may develop? Thank you.
I think so, because just think, for instance, at the how I would say the founding fathers of the UN were genius. The fact that they invented the Security Council on one side and the General Assembly on the other side was exactly the perfect model that we should try to apply. I'm leaving aside the question of the membership today of the Security Council, of course. But this idea was a brilliant idea, and we have been living with that since then. And I think we have, by way or another, in our international institutions today, to find more or less the same thing. In other words, a body that can represent in a fair way, in an equitable way, the whole membership. And a body that has to refer back to this global membership time and again to be sure that they're working in the right direction. But you'll have to invent something like that as you go ahead, because now that you have more and more actors playing in the international field, you can't get them all on board. You know, we are Klaus and myself. At least I pretend to be a professional diplomat, and we know that negotiating around a table where you have more than, let's say, I don't know the right figure, but when you start to be above 20, 25 or 30, it's becoming very difficult because it's drafting, it's a word drafting, it becomes very precise, it's a very tricky thing. So you need to be able to delegate to a group of people who will work in the name of all the others, and who will come back to them and will be sure that everybody goes on board. this is becoming more and more a need and a necessity for the European Union. It's going to be more and more a necessity for the international community. And this is why, if we want to retain some legitimacy, credibility, authority to the Security Council, we will have to change its membership, to enlarge it in order to get on board the countries that count. I was talking about Germany, you could say Japan, Brazil, a few others. We'll have to do things like that. But it's more and more obvious that we have to deal with that, whatever we may think. The fact that during the economic crisis we went from the G8 to the G20, and mind you, it's going that way. We won't go back on that, you know. The G20 is really going to be now the main body of the international community, at least in the economic field. But you can be sure that slowly they will move along in the political field also. And therefore, of course, because you're going there, you have to be sure that this G20 will be really representative of the international community, with the different group of countries being inside. Whether you have to do it on a regional basis or on other references, all this, I agree with you, it's very complicated, and it's not easy to reform our international community and our international bodies as we go along. But we have to do it, otherwise we will lack the stability that we need in our negotiations as we go along. If you have 2 or 3 more summits like the Copenhagen summit, climate change, the whole issue will be in great danger. So we really have to find a way through. France, for instance, has put on the table, Nicolas Sarkozy has just publicly voiced his concern about 1 week ago and said, after all, in Copenhagen, we had a group of 28 countries that assembled, gathered together and tried to find a way through, because they felt they were to some extent responsible. So France has been saying, why not take this group and keep on working with that, admitting that this group is going to work only on an informal basis, and that at the end the whole 192 will have to decide. But at least somebody, a group of countries, are going to push the ball forward, come out with some ideas, bring text on draft proposals on the table that they will submit to everybody, but somebody is going to do the work. If you don't do that, then you're facing great difficulties.
I agree with Pierre 100%. I appreciate, Pierre, what you said about enlarging the Security Council. The secret is to find the right balance between efficiency and legitimacy. That's the key question. And I think we need both. And I think maybe for us Europeans who have had the experience of first 6, then 12, then 15, then 27 member states, we know from first-hand experience how difficult it is. And when I look back at my time at the United Nations, I could tell you, we never achieved anything at 192. Never. You see, at the time, you waited, everybody was invited, and some people went to dinner, and others went to get a drink, and so the room got emptier and emptier, and maybe at 11 p.m., you had the people who were really interested in the issue, because they didn't care that it would be a long night, and it was an informal group, but you need a group who works. And as Pierre said, the secret is that this group must be representative of the larger whole, and they must also keep the interests of others in mind, because as much as they prepare a solution, the solution is only accepted if everybody accepts it. And so it doesn't mean that you do your little trick here and have your own little interest. It doesn't work well, because you know country 176 has to agree too. And if I don't keep their interests in mind, I won't succeed. It's difficult, but I would say there is a certain maybe special experience of the Europeans who have had more than 50 years of very difficult, and Pierre will have the same experience, long nights in Brussels where you stop the clock and work for the rest of the night. And maybe we could give a little bit of our experience here, and I very much agree with what Pierre said.
Just to go back and on our experience, to give you an example, when we were, let's say, 9 or 10 or 12 inside the European Union, and we were meeting at the level of ambassadors or at the level even of ministers, when one of us was cracking a joke, the others understood immediately, even if we had translators for that, because we didn't have too many languages. Now you have 21 or maybe 23 languages, even 23 languages in Brussels, which means that sometime what the representative from Slovakia is saying will be translated for the Maltese representative through English, maybe Spanish or German, 2 or 3 languages. When you crack a joke, it is translated 5 minutes later, more or less. So you get a total confusion because you have made your joke, you have gone to something else, somebody else has taken the floor, and suddenly everybody's laughing, and he's wondering, why are they laughing at me? I'm serious, what's going on? And he may leave the table even, and you have a diplomatic incident.
And sometimes nobody laughs because it's so awfully translated.
The joke is lost.
I'm very sorry to have to conclude our program. I'm just so delighted that we had such a wonderful turnout. Thank you so much for being an excellent audience, and please join me in thanking our most distinguished guests, our ambassadors.